Hello, students of Johnson University's Foundations in Theology class. This is your instructor, Dr. David Russell Mosley. Today I wanted to make a video in response to some of what I read in your discussion posts on the humanity of Jesus. There's some really important things here, and I touched on this a little bit in my last video, just talking about why talking about these things is important. But I really just wanted to go over the importance of Jesus being 100% human and 100% divine, and what that means. And I can't go too in depth into this. This really requires its own class on Christology. But we can at least talk about it a little bit. So, and I also wanted to briefly discuss whether or not Jesus could sin in this. That's kind of where I'm headed with this. So the first thing that we have to remember is that what the church has consistently taught from the first century onward, is that Jesus was both fully God and fully human. Right? That he was fully God. We have the Trinity, we have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are each individually as persons fully God, which this is something we'll talk about if you take my Trinity class. That they are together fully God and individually are fully God. So the Son, fully God. The Son becomes incarnate, becomes a human being. So now he is still fully God, and he is fully human. That's so very important, because that becomes... So if you read about church councils, especially in the early centuries, you will see that nearly all of the first, what we call typically the 7 ecumenical councils, are about Jesus and about whether he is fully human and fully God. So one of the first heresies that comes up in the early church about Jesus specifically, I suppose it's more the second heresy. The first heresy is Gnosticism, which actually suggests that Jesus is kind of fully God, but he's definitely not human. He's not even in the flesh. It's another subject for another day. We're going to start with Arianism. With Arianism, we get... Arius is concerned that his bishop, Alexander, is teaching something that we call sometimes Sabellianism or sometimes modalism. That is that there are not 3 persons in the Trinity. It's more like God wears 3 masks. So, in the Old Testament, he wears the Father mask. In the New Testament, he wears the Jesus mask. Or at least in the Gospels, he wears the Jesus mask. And then in the rest of the New Testament today, he wears the Holy Spirit mask. Right? That's what Arius thought his bishop was teaching. So Arius starts reading the Bible and comes to the conclusion that, in fact, Jesus is not simply... The Son is not simply a mask that God wears, but is the first and preeminent creature created by the Father. Now, this is problematic for many reasons, most of them pretty obvious, but the main one is that if Jesus is not God, how can he save us? If Jesus is not God, then what good did his becoming human and his dying on the cross for us do? What good was it if he was not God? So that obviously it's wildly problematic. Arianism is a heresy for a reason. But that's one of the first views that's out there. And so in that they had to start kind of discussing, well, how is Jesus God? So they decided that he has the same nature as the Father. This is homoousios is the Greek word for this, of the same nature. So Jesus is fully God. Well, now we have to deal with whether or not Jesus is fully human and what that means. And a 4th century theologian, Gregory of Nazianzus, he writes that, and I'm paraphrasing here roughly, that what is not assumed is not saved. And so what he means by that is, if there's any part of Jesus that isn't human, in the way that we are human, And by that he means like that we have a soul, a mind, and a body, however separable soul and mind are. If he hasn't assumed one of those things, then he's not fully human, and that thing in us is not saved. And so this was an issue because some people were contending, well, maybe Jesus had a human body, but maybe he didn't have a human soul. Maybe he didn't have a human intellect. Well, that's a problem because we sin with our intellects a lot. That's what, like lust and anger, the sins that you don't work out with your body, that you just do in your head, those are intellectual sins. Those are psychic sins in the sense that they deal with your psyche, your soul. So if Jesus doesn't have one of those, then our soul isn't saved. Our soul is still damned. Our bodies are saved, yay! But our souls are going to hell. So that's why it's important. That's why it's important that he is both fully God and fully human. But here's where the key kind of comes in, then. If he's fully human, at least as the church continued to develop their teaching on Jesus, and when I say develop, you shouldn't hear that as like add on. It's more, I think, an uncovering of what's already there. That, in the first century, in the first decades after Jesus' death, a lot of Christians were dying. Even up into the second century, a lot of Christians were being killed. There wasn't time for reflection on this stuff. But that doesn't mean that this isn't what the church believed or that this isn't what was true. Just keep that in mind. But as time allowed for more theological reflection, people began asking, did Jesus have a human will? In other words, he had a divine will, obviously, because the Son has a will. But did he have a human will? Did he will as a human being? And eventually the church decides that yes. And this causes a split at what's called the Council of Chalcedon, which was dealing partially with Nestorianism and a few other issues. Pardon me. But what's ultimately decided is that Jesus does have a human will. Because he has to, because he has a human nature. And so this allows us then to read passages like, not my will, Father, but thine be done, in the Garden of Gethsemane, and other places even, when we talk about not even the Son knows, but only the Father knows. These are things that are all in reference to Jesus' humanity. As Jesus is a human, he does not know these things, or he can, he can say, like, if I don't have to die, let that be the case, but not my will, not my human desires, not my human will, but the divine will be done. So this then begs the question, and this is something that a lot of you raise, and it's an important question: could Jesus have sinned? I believe the answer to that question is no. And here's why. So a lot of you talked about Jesus being fully human has to mean being human exactly like us. But as your sin papers hopefully kind of showed you, whether you buy into total depravity or original sin or not, it's pretty clear that we're not exactly as we should be. Because if we were exactly as we should be, we wouldn't choose to sin. Or at least it would be an issue that perhaps we'd delay a lot longer. Because as a parent, and if any of you are parents, I think you can certainly say that, like, your children sin pretty early. Like, under 2 years old, for sure. Do they do things that they know they ought not to do? Right. So if there's absolutely nothing wrong with us, like if Pelagius is right, that doesn't make any sense. That we would choose to sin before we really even fully comprehend all of what we're doing. We just know that we're not supposed to, and we do it anyway. But I want to suggest that Jesus doesn't have humanity in the exact same way that we do. Because Jesus was sinless. Jesus did not sin. Now here, I mean, I am more or less a proponent of original sin, just not total depravity. And that does make a bit of a difference here. But, I mean, we need to think through this. And I think that Jesus' humanity is not a fallen humanity. It has some aspects of our fallenness in that, as some of you pointed out, he got hungry, he needed to sleep, which, frankly, whether or not those are actually parts of our fallenness is up for debate. The fact that, like, we begin to decay if we don't do those things is definitely part of our fallenness. But Jesus' body was also capable of being killed. Right? He does, in fact, die. In fact, it's a huge issue if he didn't actually die, and I'll probably be making a video about that after I grade your atonement papers. But I think we need to think of Jesus' humanity more in line with how Adam's humanity is described in Genesis. And in fact, so Paul tells us that Jesus is the new Adam. And I think how we need to understand that is that the humanity that Jesus had was perfect humanity. It's the kind of humanity we were meant to have, and it's the kind of humanity we will have in the life to come. But it is not the kind of humanity that we have right now. We as human beings are not fully human. And we know that because we sin. We are awaiting our full humanity when Christ returns. And when we're resurrected. But Jesus already had that full humanity from the moment of his conception onward. Okay? So that's that on sin. Just a brief aside here about what Jesus knew and didn't know and so on. Again, I want to refer you back to what I've just said about having a human intellect as well as a divine, a human will as well as a divine. That Jesus, in his humanity, developed just like any other human develops. But that doesn't mean that he stopped being divine. I also want to caution you, we can read Philippians, I think it's Philippians 2, that our attitude ought to be the same as that of Jesus Christ, who did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, so on and so forth, but lowered himself or emptied himself. Kenosis is the Greek word there. We need to be careful thinking of this kenosis, this self-emptying, meaning that he emptied himself of certain divine attributes. And the reason for that is that gives us kind of two tiers of divine attributes. There are essential divine attributes, and there are inessential divine attributes. And so Jesus, the Son rids himself of the inessential divine attributes, omnipresence, omniscience, and so on, but maintains whatever the essential divine attributes are. The problem is the Bible doesn't give us any indication that there are levels of divine attributes. They're just divine attributes, and they are eternal. And they are all of them necessary, because without them, God wouldn't be God. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. God bless, keep doing good work, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye.